moving through the 1950s and into the 1960s, we come up with the live TV generation. And these are mostly young men, a few women, but mostly young men. And they started in live TV in the 1950s. They're not as famous as the film school generation, but they made big contributions to motion pictures in the 1960s. And they were not making big, bloated sorts of Hollywood movies. They're making very lean and very interesting and much smaller sorts of movies, but they were making them on television, and they were doing it live. And chief among them, John Frankenheimer, made many, many live TV shows, and he went on to make feature films. So did Arthur Penn with Bonnie and Clyde, Norman Jewison, Sidney Pollack, and Sidney Lumet. So all these very young men, they would have been in their 20s when they were doing this in the 1950s, transitioned to California, the West Coast, and they started making some very interesting films and brought a new sensibility to their movie making. A little bit like what we're going to be coming up with in just a little bit, which is the French New Wave. So they were shooting very lean movies, not big budget stuff, and they're shooting movies for television, really, 90-minute television shows with very interesting themes, sort of adult themes for television, really, when you get down to it. And that is to be contrasted with the kinds of movies that were being made in Hollywood, trying to slow the advancement or to compete with television. And the author of our textbook calls this the bloated era. Attendance is still dropping through the 1950s since the rise of television, chipping away at theater attendance. And this is going to be emphasized and represented by Cleopatra. And when we adjust for inflation, this movie would have cost somewhere around $300 million in today's dollars. There are a few movies today that get up this high, that's for sure. But back then it was pretty rare for big movies for 150, 200, 250 million dollars. Again, once we adjust for inflation. This is a movie starring Elizabeth Taylor, right there on the right, and Richard Burton. And Elizabeth Taylor had the very first $1 million contract. She was a pretty big star. I think she'd already won an Oscar by this point, and she and Richard Burton were going to shoot this movie together. They started off in England, and the weather in England is not very close to the weather in Italy or in Egypt. So they ended up packing up, the producers and directors ended up packing up and moving the whole show to Italy. And they had a rather notorious on-screen and off-screen love affair. They were both married to other people at the time. And in the evenings and weekends after the shooting of the film had taken place, they would be off in nightclubs and in restaurants and the back corner booth and making out and all that. And they had to have known that they were being watched. It appeared practically the next day in the press. And some people say any publicity is good publicity. Maybe so, maybe so. Still, America and the world was a lot more conservative back then, and the whole idea of committing adultery is what they were doing. Committing adultery in plain view was possibly going to cause some trouble, maybe some boycotts, things like that. If you want to sneak around, in your hotel, you pay off maybe the maid or somebody or the bellboy, and you sneak into somebody else's room at the hotel. So the whole idea of them going to nightclubs and so on, plainly they knew what they were doing. But this film lost tons of money. in the outset. It took a long time for it to make its money back, and since most movies use money that is borrowed from a bank, you want to pay back the loan as fast as you can to avoid too much interest. And the fact that this movie took maybe 8 or 10 years to pay back all the money means that in the end it really ended up losing quite a bit. And the studio, 20th Century Fox, ended up having to sell off some of its lot and so on, like other studios of the era. They were all having hard times, and a number of them started selling off some of their props, and MGM with selling off Judy Garland or Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz's ruby slippers and things like that. 20th Century Fox, this studio here from Cleopatra, sold off hundreds of acres of its back lot, and that ended up becoming Century City, which is up on the west side of LA, south of Beverly Hills. Pretty expensive land right there, but that became Century City. So if you're up there, there's a big office buildings and a mall and a lot of nice housing, and that was 20th Century Fox. And there were too many movies like that. That wasn't the only one. There were really dozens of big bloated movies. The studios thought that was the best way to compete with television. Television was small, so to speak, on maybe 21-inch television. Diagonal TVs, the TVs weren't very big. 21 or 27-inch TVs would have been a pretty big TV back then. We have computer monitors that are that big today. And so television, mostly in black and white, and smaller, really much smaller than movies, especially so back then. And so the movie studios thought, we will put big movies, widescreen movies, long movies, 3-4 hour long movies, color, movies long enough that they would need an intermission, and so on. Roadshow movies, we've talked about roadshow movies, and they would make fewer of them. Since they cost more money, they would make fewer of them. And this isn't really a very good business decision, as it turns out. Movies have always been really entertainment for the masses. They cost much less than going to the theater, going to a concert, even going out to dinner, aside from something in a fast food place. Movies are cheap entertainment. They go all the way back to Nickelodeons and so on. And the idea of more expensive tickets for these roadshow movies and really long and intermissions, the idea was that movies would be special. You might even get dressed up to go out to the movies, just like you would get dressed up to go out to the theater. And really not the wisest move. TV or movies and TV, but movies really are a mass medium, really for the masses. And so these big color roadshow movies was not working very well at all. So contrasting that was what they were movies that were happening overseas. And in Italy, they had neo-realist films, new realism, neo-realist films, small movies, mostly black and white, low budget, all that. English had a few movies that were dubbed kitchen sink cinema, in that they would just be scenes in houses, normal houses, not palaces or pyramids and things like that, with chariot races and big stuff like that. It would just be in a normal English house, and you could see the kitchen sink. So somebody dubbed them kitchen sink cinema. But the one that was the most famous is the French New Wave. Was the French New Wave, Nouvelle Vague. Sometimes if you're reading it in online or something, that New Wave. And the very first one was Breathless, made in 1959 and finally came to the States in 1960. and directed by Jean-Luc Godard, and co-written with Francois Truffaut. And both of these gentlemen were film critics, and they loved American movies. They loved American movies. They loved film noir. They loved the Humphrey Bogart movies and all that. And they really thought American movies had lost their way with the big bloated cinema that was emanating from Hollywood. And eventually, most critics are going to get told, if you're so smart, why don't you make a movie? Why don't you show them how to do it if you're so smart, right? Everybody loves to rag on critics. So they said, okay, we will, right? They sort of took them up. They took up their critics and said, we will, right? We're going to go out, we're going to make movies, and we're going to be all stripped down, and we're not going to make big, bloated movies like Hollywood is doing. So they broke a lot of the rules of classic Hollywood cinema. That's a big part of it. And of course, this became very popular on college campuses and things like that. These wonderful, quirky little small French New Wave movies, and sort of a slice of life movies. They didn't have dolly tracks. Okay, they would just carry it around by hand, handheld. That's something that Hollywood very rarely did, was handheld shooting. Sometimes if they wanted a smoother shot, they could push somebody around in a wheelchair or some kind of a cart or something like that. They didn't get shooting permits. They would hide the camera and put the camera in a canvas bag. I understand at one point they got like a mail bag and cut a hole in it for the lens and shot through that. So the camera operator would have been holding the camera about waist high. You can kind of tell from this shot right here, the camera's about waist high and backing up. Maybe one other person was right there with them. They would dub the dialogue in later, so there's no reflectors, there's no dolly tracks, there's nothing like that. And they're just going to shoot right on the streets of Paris, at the main shopping thoroughfare, the Champs-Élysées, places like that. Of course, they didn't have lights, none of that. They didn't have any of that, and they would not even do traditional editing. If they thought a scene was running a little bit long, they would just chop it up. Normally, if you're shooting a scene with two people like this, even student filmmakers, you'd shoot the whole scene over at least 3 times. You'd shoot the whole scene on the two of them in a sort of a cover shot, and then you'd shoot the whole scene on him, and he would say his lines and react to her and so on, and then you'd go back to the beginning, reset, and shoot the whole thing on her and her dialogue and reactions and so on medium shots and close-ups. Probably a lot more than 3 times, but 3 times would be kind of a bare minimum, right, for what they call in the business coverage. Right? You want to cover various angles and all that. In Hollywood, they might take all day or even more than a day to shoot a 3 or 4 minute scene of 2 people walking down the street. But the French filmmakers, they don't have all day, they don't have shooting permits. They're just going to shoot the whole thing in one shot, in one take, and just on a 2 shot on the 2 of them. And if they need high angles or anything like that, they don't have cranes or jibs or anything like that. They're going to find a window up there, an office window or somebody's apartment or something like that, and go up there, and that's where they're going to get their high angle shots. And the scene that you're going to watch, amazingly, the entire movie is for free on YouTube. And I don't expect you to watch the whole movie, so I've marked out 2 or 3 sections that I normally would show in class, mostly them walking around, and I like to point out, with my laser pointer, I like to point out the people that sort of are looking a little bit at them. But it's a big city, Paris, just like New York maybe, or LA, and big city people, they've got places to go and everything. They're not exactly going to stop and watch for a long time, but it is fun to watch people walking along the streets. and sort of looking at them a little bit. And in one scene, a young serviceman from, I don't know, maybe he's in the Navy or Army or something. He's in uniform, and he's gonna bum a light from this guy here, Jean-Paul Belmondo, and Belmondo's gonna stay right in character. He's gonna say, I don't have a light. Go find your own light. And the girl is Jean Seberg, and she has quite an interesting life story herself. And you can check her out as well. But she's a little untraditional here. She's wearing slacks. Yeah, some women in the late 1950s and early 1960s maybe were wearing slacks and so on. But you know, most young ladies would be wearing dresses and probably have longer hair, and not this very short sort of a French cut like that. If you think like Marilyn Monroe or something like that, that's the way American movie stars were back in the early 1960s. Not in this sort of boyish look with the slacks and the very short cropped hair and all that. And so Jean Seberg is American. So when she speaks, she'll be speaking French with an American accent. Maybe you can tell, maybe not. And the clip, or the film, actually the entire film, but the parts of the film that I've marked out for you to watch, there are no subtitles, and that's good. Normally I turn the subtitles off when I show clips from this film. I don't want you reading the subtitles and losing track. I want you to watch the visuals, watch that it looks like somebody's holding the camera about waist high and backing up, and that it's handheld, and people sort of walking by on the street, some of them turning around a little bit to look and then walking on. So don't worry about no subtitles in the clip you're going to watch. I turn them off anyway. So what did they use? They didn't use dolly tracks and shooting permits and cranes and lights and all that. But they did have a script. So they weren't just making up the whole thing. The whole thing wasn't improvisation or anything like that. They did have a script of sorts, but everything else was breaking the rules, right? The French New Wave. And it wasn't around for a long time, well, maybe 3 or 4 years. But you know, by the 1990s, people were doing various things like that, shooting movies with video and not having any music. So any music that you'd hear in the movie would have to be coming from a radio that would be seen in the movie, or perhaps if there's a band or something like that. But all of the music in some of these movies that were made in Denmark and other places like that in the 1990s really takes off from this. And this look, this sort of handheld, herky-jerky look, they are doing it because they don't have a shooting permit and they can't lay down dolly tracks and all that sort of thing. And they are sort of taking on the look of documentary filmmaking. And, you know, in a lot of documentary films, there's no time to stop, set up tripods and things like that. And, you know, and in a war zone, especially, you're running and shooting and the camera's all bouncing around and herky-jerky and everything. And even so, a lot of documentaries, you really want to capture truth. That's the whole idea. Capture truth as it is. You don't want to have too much artifice with reflectors and dolly tracks and all that. So if this were a documentary, it would probably look very similar to the way it looks now. And so they're sort of borrowing from that documentary look. After this film, the Beatles film, A Hard Day's Night, kind of has a lot of this style. And we've already talked about Hard Day's Night. Maybe you've looked at some clips from it, but they are handheld and it's black and white, and it really seems kind of off the cuff like that too, kind of a documentary look. But if we flash forward 30 years, then we get a lot of these sort of fake documentaries, confessional type documentaries, what people turn to the camera and talk directly to the camera about, you know, what they're thinking, borrowing techniques from documentaries and from this film. So shows like The Office or Big Brother and some of those kinds of shows. They're doing that whole herky-jerky camera movement and zooming and all that kind of stuff, but they don't really need to. Movies have done that. Some of the Bourne Identity movies have done that. It really was a thing for maybe 10 years or so. Thankfully, it's kind of fading away, but they're really trying to make movies look fresh and now and urgent, and we don't have time to set up tripods and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of those movies are very big budget movies, and the same thing for television shows. NYPD Blue and some other shows, Modern Family go for that look, and The Office, they go for that look. But those are union shoots, and they all get to take breaks and everything, and they're just sort of bouncing the camera around to make it look like it's a documentary. It really isn't. And I don't know, I'm not a big fan of that sort of fake herky-jerky look. I'm fine with it if it's needed, if you don't have a shooting permit or whatever, I'm fine with it, but sort of doing it on purpose, it's not really my thing. But anyway, everybody gets to make their own choice. Okay, we are now going to transition to Stanley Kubrick. The rest of the class, actually. Oh, and before I forget, there is a nice trailer for Cleopatra. Let me just go back to Cleopatra here real quickly. There's a nice trailer for Cleopatra as a roadshow movie, and they're going to talk about reserve your seat now and that sort of thing. So that is kind of fun. I've never seen one before like that about reserving your seats for a roadshow movie. So I almost forgot. Okay, back to Stanley Kubrick. American director, definitely an auteur. We're going to probably watch more Stanley Kubrick movies in this class than any other director, because he works in so many different genres and styles and so on. And he's a favorite of mine, but he's well regarded in the film community. He's really legendary, a real genius. So we're going to spend the rest of the class looking at 3 Stanley Kubrick films. And when I teach this class in the classroom, in person, we would spend a lot of time looking at lots of scenes of these 3 films, Dr. Strangelove and 2001 and A Clockwork Orange. So there are quite a few clips that I've got marked out for you with the URLs and all that. Works out just fine. I've been testing out the emails and the URLs and all that, and at least on my phone, everything comes out quite nicely. So spend some time, and like I say, I would be in class, I would be spending a lot of time on these 3 films, watching bits and pieces of them from beginning to end. So, and if you can find the film, by the way, if you're into it, if you've got a copy of the film, if you can find it, I'm not telling you to spend money on these films, to spend $3 or whatever renting the movie or downloading it or whatever. But if you've got it around, or if it looks kind of interesting to you, that's really the way to go. They're really all worth watching from start to finish. So I'm sorry I have to do it with clips. When I bring the DVDs into class, I can do it a little bit better. It's not bad. I've spent a lot of time tracking down these clips and putting them in the right order, so they're in the order, chronological order that you'd see in the movie. So be sure to watch those clips. I would listen to the discussion on Dr. Strangelove, and then pause that part of it. Stay right there on YouTube, and then go watch the 7 or so clips from Dr. Strangelove, and then continue on that way. That's the way I'd be doing it in class, and if you can replicate that, then that's really the best way, I think, to go through the movies. Okay, a wonderful scene from 2001, wonderful sets, and he spent 4 years making the movie. He worked in many genres. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to name them off or to match them or anything like that. Just the fact that he worked in many genres is really the key. And these are most of his films. I might be missing a couple in here. I don't have Barry Lyndon on there, and that's a good movie. It's not exactly my taste, but it's photographically, it's a gorgeous movie. And some early stuff. But basically, that's about it for Kubrick. And so some film noir, a couple of war movies, Full Metal Jacket and Paths of Glory, a big historical epic, Spartacus, Lolita, a very odd comedy, drama, romance sort of a film about a adult man and a 12-year-old girl, and he falls in love with her. And they amazingly managed to make it and get it in theaters and everything and pass the censors. It's based on a rather famous book, but he was obsessed with her. He got the author of the book, Vladimir Nabokov, to write the screenplay, and he wisely made it much more of a comedy. And Peter Sellers, who is going to do extensive work in Dr. Strangelove, played a couple of parts in the movie and really sort of changes the tone of it. But anyway, it's a very, very challenging movie, very odd movie. It wouldn't even be rated R, but it's you can tell what's going on. Dr. Strangelove is a black comedy, and a black comedy doesn't have anything to do with race, has to do with dark subject matter, whether it is perhaps the funeral industry or nuclear war, as this one is, or perhaps the coronavirus. Okay, maybe somebody would make a comedy about the coronavirus. Okay, that would be a black comedy. And then moving on, 2001, sci-fi, very scientific, not much fantasy or anything like that you might find in Star Wars. It's more what they call hard science. Clockwork Orange, dystopian future. We're going to spend a chunk of time on Clockwork Orange. The Shining, we've already looked at when we talked about the stages of the genre film, and it's a revisionist horror film. And Full Metal Jacket, when we start talking about Vietnam War movies, we will come up and look at a couple of scenes from Full Metal Jacket as well. And then his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, with Tom Cruise and his then wife, Nicole Kidman. All right, let's dive in to Dr. Strangelove. 1964, the same year that the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night came out, by the way, and it is a black comedy. Peter Sellers played 3 parts: President Merkin Muffley, Dr. Strangelove, and Colonel Mandrake. And they were having a lot of fun with the names of the characters in this movie. Let's see here, what's on the next slide. Yeah, Doubleentendre. Okay, nice French word. A lot of the names have double meaning. Okay, turgid is to be firm and erect. Okay, so they're having fun with that. Jack the Ripper, easy. Bat, guano, his nickname is Bat. I don't know if it's Bartholomew or something, but Bat. And guano is the scientific term for bird shit, basically. Okay, bird shit. So this guy is bat shit crazy. Yes, okay, so Bat, guano, Major King Kong. We get Premier Kiss Off. Okay, that's fun. And de Sadeski, taking off from the Marquis de Sade, who wrote a few hundred years ago about the pleasure of giving and receiving pain, spanking, that sort of thing, bondage. So that's the Marquis de Sade. So we have, I think he's Ambassador de Sadeski, something like that. We have the La Puta Air Base. And if you are a Spanish speaker, you know that puta would be prostitute. There's Peter Sellers as Dr. Strangelove. Let's go back. And President Merkin Muffley, very obscure, very, very obscure. A merkin is a pubic wig. Yes, there is such a thing. It is a pubic wig, and I don't know where that came from. I don't know what kind of a word it is, English or French or something, but that's what it is, and that is our president, the president's name, Merkin Muffley, Dr. Strangelove, okay, and then Colonel Mandrake, and Mandrake is a poisonous root. And here we are in the War Room, an amazing set designed by the same guy that designed a lot of the James Bond sets in the early going, Goldfinger and some of that. His name is Ken Adam, and really a fantastic set. When one of our more recent presidents became president, he wanted to see the War Room, and somebody had to tell him, well, that was just a movie set. There really isn't a war room, Mr. President, but in the movie it's, I don't know, beneath, I guess, way underground at the Pentagon, something like that. But it really is an amazing set. And they sort of have like a computer simulated screens right here, and they had to take 16 millimeter cameras, go behind there and sort of do a rear projection thing. So these seem to be almost like computer projections, but they're film cameras that are projecting from behind, that had to be made and animated and all that. And Kubrick did that on the airplane, and then he did a lot of that sort of thing in 2001. There are lots of computer screens in 2001. Computer screens couldn't do what they wanted them to do in 2001, so they filmed from textbooks and animations and things like that, and then projected them from behind the set, little bunches of film projectors strapped to the set, and the whole set would be revolving in some cases, and the film projectors had to be able to project upside down, and round they would go to make it look like the video monitors, the computer screens, were actually doing computing. But they didn't have that technology back then, so they had to use film projectors. Okay, and there's Peter Sellers as Dr. Strangelove, and he is kind of based on some German physicists and doctors and so on. We got a number of them from Nazi Germany, and Dr. Strangelove here, once he appears on screen toward the later parts of the movie, we will see that he has lost control. He has his arms, but he's not in full control of his arms. It's a real thing, by the way. It's a real thing. But Strangelove does involuntarily Heil salute, and we know he's a former Nazi with his involuntary heiling, and his phantom arm starts choking him at one point. It's very funny stuff. Peter Sellers is just amazing in the film. He also plays the president, fairly straight. Everybody around the president is pretty weird and pretty crazy, and so when he is playing President Merkin Muffley, he is doing it. There's not very much comedy in his performance. The comedy is all around him, and then Colonel Mandrake, who is the assistant to the crazy general that starts the whole thing off. This is some of Kubrick's cameras and things like that he used in some of his films, and they had a display at the museum, the county museum, and I went to see it and took some photos of some of this stuff, so thought it might be kind of fun to check it out. There's these amazing lenses, the candlelight lens, shooting literally in candlelight in Barry Lyndon. And here is the survival kit from Dr. Strangelove. and I believe I have the scene where he reads off the survival kit contents, and it's really quite fun. So the scenes that I have marked out is one of the very first scenes in the movie with the general's secretary. And when you watch that, I want you to notice a couple of things. First off, it is all done in one take. It's not a real difficult take, but it's all done in one take. There's no editing or anything like that. And the scene opens up, and the secretary is in a bikini, and she's under a sun lamp in a hotel room, and she takes a call for the general, who is in the bathroom, and she's talking to another general, and it appears she knows the other general, at least by his first name. She starts calling him Freddie, so perhaps she knows him on a more friendly sort of a basis, let's say, as well. And she does a pretty good job. Notice how good of a job she does sort of smoothing out her general's rough and gruff demeanor. She's going to say he's in the powder room, and the general requests that I take your message. In the meantime, he's sort of barking and being very gruff and so on off camera. But as a good secretary, she's being very diplomatic about the whole thing. And she tells him, the general's in the powder room. Can you tell me what it's all about? And Freddie, okay, does. He tells her, yeah, there's an attack. And wing attack plan R and the whole bit. And he has no problems telling the secretary all this. So that's really kind of funny. Miss Scott is her name. And earlier in the film, when we're up in the B-52 bomber, one of the crew members has a girly magazine, and he opens up the centerfold, and there is Miss Scott. And then later on in the movie, we see Miss Scott. So some little Easter eggs sort of floating through the movie. Then later on, we have another scene. I'm going to describe some of the scenes. Normally, I'd be talking through these clips as we watch them, and I'm going to do that right now. So we have the crazy general who decided he wanted to set his bomber squadron off on Wing Attack Plan R. He wants to start the war. He thinks if we have the drop on the Russians, or the Ruskies as he calls them, or the commies, he's using all sorts of derogatory terms. And he talks about water quite a bit, and fluoridation. And he believes that fluoride in the water, and we know it to be a deterrent to cavities, but he believes fluoride in the water is a communist plot. Okay, so he's very paranoid, and that's a big reason why he decides to start this all off. So there's that, and we still have paranoid people today, and fake news and all that kind of stuff. So the movie is really making fun of that sort of thing. The next scene, Hello Dmitri, is the president talking to the Russian premier, or president, I guess. And it's a very funny phone call. It sounds like a parent talking to a child. At first, he's going to say, now Dmitri, one of our generals went and did a silly thing. He went a little funny in the head. Okay, now that's the way we talk to children. Okay, what's going on with with the war, or with the 9/11 or something like that. And so he's sort of talking to the premier almost like a child. He went and did a silly thing. He went a little funny in the head. And then it's going to sound like a lover's quarrel. I can be just as sorry as you can. I can be even more sorry. And it almost sounds like they're having a spat on the phone. So that's Hello Dmitri. Then we get the survival kit contents, and our pilot of the B-52 bomber, played by Slim Pickens. What a wonderful name. He often played westerns and cowboy roles and that sort of thing. Kubrick told him it was a drama, there's no comedy, told him to play it like a drama. And so he's going to read the survival kit contents, which are, they start off fairly serious with a pistol and possible painkillers and things like that. And then it gets into the sort of thing that a soldier might use possibly during wartime. What some of our soldiers in World War II in Germany could maybe trade chocolates or cigarettes or nylons or something like that, maybe possibly to young women, maybe in trade for sex, something like that. So this very unusual survival kit contents is funnier and funnier the longer he reads the list. And at the very end, he's going to say, shoot, a feller could have a pretty good time in Dallas with all this stuff. And if you look very closely, you'll see that his lips are a little bit off, and that's because President Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. I'm sorry. He says a feller could have a pretty good time in Vegas with all that stuff. He says a feller could have a pretty good weekend in Vegas with all that stuff. Well, originally he says a feller could have a pretty good time in Dallas. Dallas is where President Kennedy was assassinated, so they went back in and looped over the dialogue, changing Dallas to Vegas. So they did a pretty good job. You probably wouldn't notice it if I hadn't told you about it. Then we get a bomb run, which is a lot of fun. Check that one out. It's a very classic scene. It's a classic scene, slim pickings. I don't want to give it away. You'll see it. And when you see it, it is instantly recognizable. It has been parodied dozens of times from Homer Simpson on. And when we see the bomb run, the pilot of the plane, they have a near miss. The Russians are trying to shoot them down. The president has warned the Russians that our planes are coming through, which horrifies one of the generals. But he says we can't start nuclear war. So they survive a near miss. They lose a lot of their electronics, and some of the electronics they lose have to do with the bomb bay doors that won't open. So our pilot, Colonel Kong, goes in to try to fix the electronics. He's sitting on top of one of the bombs, and when he finally fixes the electronics, the doors open. So that's a classic scene. Then we're going to get Dr. Strangelove talking about, in the event of the nuclear war, perhaps we can preserve the essence of our government and society by digging into a mountain. He talks about mine shafts, and that they could build living space for thousands of people. And the odd thing about all this is that we actually have that. In a mountain in West Virginia, there is a half hollowed out mountain, and if there is a very bad war, then the president and members of Congress and the cabinet have a place to go, living quarters, a hospital, markets, all that kind of stuff. So as far out and strange as it sounds, with Strangelove talking about preserving the best parts of society, it actually has happened. And of course he gets the general's interest by saying that we need to repopulate the country, so there would possibly be 3 or 4 women for every man, so that with the birth rate and so on, we could help repopulate the country. So I don't think that's part of the plan today, but General Turgidson is very interested in that part of Strangelove's idea. And then at the very end, Dr. Strangelove and his phantom arm with the hialing and choking himself and all that. It's very fun stuff. It's a great movie to watch. I have a lot of the clips. What you might do is watch some of the clips and see where they lead you, go down the rabbit hole, see where they lead you, and watch some of that stuff on your own. I think it's a lot of fun. So next up, Kubrick's masterpiece, 2001, A Space Odyssey. That's the full title. From 1968. He started on it in 1964, right after Dr. Strangelove came out. He thought it would be out by 65 or 66, 67 at the latest, but it didn't come out until 1968. And it really is an amazing film. This is all pre-CGI. It's all models, right? There's nothing done in computers or anything like that, but you wouldn't even notice it. It has aged so well. It is just astounding how good the movie looks. They took a lot of care to get the latest scientific knowledge and technology and so on to get the latest knowledge and technology and so on from the experts at the time. And we even see a kind of an inspiration for George Lucas. We see the not quite finished space wheel. This is the space station, and it is going to be spinning round and round, creating an artificial gravity. We know that when men and women are in space for long periods of time, they lose muscle mass and bone mass, and it is a real hardship. All that weightlessness, you wouldn't think, but it's a real hardship on people that spend that much time in space. And you can create with centrifugal force a kind of artificial gravity. I keep wondering why we haven't done something like that yet today, but apparently, I don't know, maybe it's too expensive, I'm not sure what, but it seems like a pretty good idea. So some of the sets, you'll see them sort of curving off into the distance. And so there's this big, giant space wheel somewhere between the Earth and the Moon. And then once the ship is full of astronauts ready to head to Jupiter, where the alien signal is emanating from, there's a sort of a smaller version of that. And we see an amazing jogging sequence of the astronaut. It looks like he's jogging sort of up the wall and across the ceiling and back down again. That's not the one, but it kind of gives you that feeling since it's much smaller. You can see the whole thing all in one shot. So yes, lots of scientific accuracy, and the movie starts out with pre-humans, sort of halfway between apes and humans, and they are visited. We don't see them, we never see the aliens, but we see a black monolith with the particular dimensions, 149, right? The square root of 1 is 1, the square root of 2 is 4, the square root of 3 is 9. And anyway, the aliens have left it there. They are hoping to help whoever these creatures are going to be push their evolution along a little further and a little faster. So the anthropods, I guess, I'm not sure what else, that's sort of the ape men, are going to be inspired to use tools, presumably also fire, but with tools, being able to eat meat. All that protein is good for the brain, and along with fire, then we can have much faster cognitive abilities, brain development, and all that sort of thing. And then there is one of the two most famous edits in film history, along with the edit from Lawrence of Arabia with the match and the desert. And this one, one of the apes with the bone as a weapon has beaten back the challenge of another tribe, and so we have the first weapon. Okay, so it's sort of good for hunting, but it's also kind of a weapon as well, right? Next, what's next? Okay, rocks, bow and arrow, and on through, right? The beginning of tools, that's for sure, but also the beginning of weapons. Anyway, the ape is going to, in victory, he's going to howl and throw the bone up in the air, and Kubrick is going to cut 5 million years into the future and a match cut of an orbiting satellite. So a very famous edit. I believe I have that in the list of scenes that you can see. I found that online as well. And there's a wonderful scene called the Blue Danube. And when Kubrick was editing the movie in his private editing studio, he would just play music while he was editing, and he thought it looked pretty nice. He was going to have an original score, but he liked some of the classical music, so he ended up using the Blue Danube, and that's the name of that scene, as this ship is going to have to start rotating to match the rotation of the space wheel, and it's going to match up, and then one of our scientists is going to get on board, and they're going to take him to the moon, where they have found a black monolith. And for us viewers, it's the second one, but as far as they know, it is the first evidence of life off Earth. Okay, some kind of intelligent life off Earth. We know we didn't put it there. Somebody must have put it there, and so it's quite exciting, but they try to keep it secret. And once it's been uncovered, it's been placed a few meters below the surface of the Earth, and once the sunlight hits it, it is sort of like a warning system that once those apes on Earth have made it to the moon, then they have the technology at their disposal to take the next step. And it's sort of a sentinel. The story's called The Sentinel that it's based on, from Arthur C. Clarke. So the sun hits it, it sends out a loud noise signal, and it is aimed toward Jupiter. So they put together a spacecraft and 2 astronauts piloting it, and I believe 4 others in a kind of hibernation. So you'll see all that. I've got the jogging, seeing him jogging up the space wheel and down and around and so on. And the computer is named HAL. And here's a bit of a look at the set. There he is. So here he is jogging. He's on the inside of this big giant thing. It was, 5 stories high. The whole thing had to rotate. It was an amazing set. And if you're, when you go online, you will see film of it rotating. And sometimes the actor would have to start the camera because no one else could be in it. The scene would shoot the entire interior of this space wheel. And so nobody could be there, not even a camera operator. There's a part where the floor sort of opens up and the camera passes through, and then the floor closes back down again. So I've got a pretty good making of documentary in there. It's a little longer. You don't have to watch it. It's like maybe 40 minutes, but it's a pretty good documentary. There's a lot of stuff on 2001 online. And you can watch as little or as much of the extra stuff. Please watch, the Bone and the Blue Danube and the Pan Am spaceship. There's a stewardess sort of walking with grip-soled shoes, jogging on the space wheel, and so on. So watch the main parts I've got, but then there's a bunch of pretty good documentaries. I found one that I kind of like, hosted by James Cameron, that I think you might like. But it's 40 minutes long, and you don't have to watch all of that. So the crux of the movie is that HAL, the computer, makes a mistake. And computers don't make mistakes. They're programmed to zeros and ones and all that. They're not supposed to make mistakes. They think that HAL has made a mistake. They think that maybe they need to disconnect him, at least the higher functions. He can still keep heating the spaceship and whatever and providing the oxygen, but they want to unhook Hal, and Hal catches wind of it and goes homicidal, and he turns off all of the life functions on the hibernating astronauts. I don't know, there's in there somewhere, the hibernating astronauts. And one of the other two is outside of the spaceship, and he gets his air cut off. And so the last astronaut, Dave, is outside of the capsule. He went out to retrieve his friend, the other astronaut, and he went out so fast that he didn't take his helmet with him. So he has to use his ingenuity to get back inside the ship, which he does, and unhook the higher brain functions of Hal. It's a very disturbing scene with the computer. He says, "Help me, please stop, I'm dying, and so on." And it's a computer, so it's very interesting to see. And of course, Hal has killed 5 humans, so maybe he should be shut down. Fantastic scene. Then Dave gets close to Jupiter, and there is a last monolith floating in space around one of the moons of Jupiter. And he gets in his little pod and goes towards that and goes through what we assume is some sort of a Stargate. And that is the very trippy sequence of the movie. So young people of that era started showing up. It was made kind of for families and so on, and adults. It's sort of a thinking person's sci-fi, very hard science and all that, but the theater owners and the studio started noticing more and more young people, some of them likely tripping on acid would be the term, LSD, take an LSD trip. And so they went with it. And the advertising, the ultimate trip, and that's the actual poster from the film. So it's really astounding that they would do something like that and call the movie The Ultimate Trip. And so he, after Hal, I'm afraid, he goes through the section called Beyond the Infinite. And then we see the scene of him in a very nice hotel room, and we assume that the aliens want to make the human feel comfortable and not nervous or anything like that. So they construct something from, I imagine, human memory or his mind or something. They maybe probe his mind and construct something to make him feel kind of at home and nice and all that. And then we have the Star Child. So it's a really fantastic film. I can't speak highly enough from it. It's it had its 50th anniversary a couple years ago. Christopher Nolan loved it so much he helped in the restoration of it, and sort of presented it. Every director, of anything, not just sci-fi like George Lucas, but or Steven Spielberg, but even Martin Scorsese, is a highly revered film. And over the years, it has gone up in estimation from this bizarre film that nobody could quite figure out what it was all about. And the ending is very open. It's a very open ending. It's not for everyone. If you saw Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, then if you liked it, then you would kind of like this movie, I think. Right? I think you would like this movie. But if you didn't like Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, then you might stay away from it. And like I say, Christopher Nolan, clearly he loves this movie and wanted to present it. A couple years ago, it played at the Cinerama Dome up in Hollywood. Okay, so I think I said Clockwork Orange, but I see in my notes that Clockwork Orange will be coming up later once we get into the 70s. So that's fine. We've gone long enough. Like I said, I've only got like, you know, Cleopatra and Breathless, and then the rest is on Kubrick for this class. So I show big chunks of both of these movies, and I have lots of clips lined up for you. So please, please spend some time and go through clips and go down the rabbit hole and find other clips and other documentaries and other things on there. You're right there on YouTube. And so you can stop my discussion every once in a while and go over and look at some clips and things like that, and then go back to the discussion and so on. And really get in, enjoy, appreciate the movie, and enjoy the ultimate trip. And like I said, Clockwork Orange and Full Metal Jacket will be coming up a little later in the semester. Okay, the slide